Hey YouTube, so I wanted to put together a video for you guys that is a challenge that a lot of my in-person students have. So many people don't know the steps that you need to take in order to plan out a still life drawing. So a lot of my students in person have to draw a still life on site at an interview to get into one of the local art schools in town. And so we do a lot of practice runs in the studio so that they know how to set everything up, and I wanted to show you those same steps. So one of the challenges that a lot of people have when they're doing a still life is that it's difficult to plan all of these objects on the page and account for the space of the page and the number of things that you have to fit in the page. So a lot of times what happens is the opposite of what you see here, where I have all this extra space on this side. Instead, what I usually see happens is that people will start on one side and work towards the other side, and they won't leave room for their last object. So what we want to do is we want to lightly box in the shapes of all the objects and consider the relationship in the height and the width and the space between the objects as well, in order to make a plan so that you can see how everything is going to fit in. So you can see that what I did here was I just boxed in without a whole lot of attention to detail. If you're doing something like the pear, you could even do something that's just like a box like this, so that you're going to just give a basic outline to where each object is going to be placed in relationship to each other. That gives you something to work on and to correct. Here I did that a lot darker. I'm using a 3B just so that you all can see it on the camera. But if I were doing this for my own work, I would be using an F or an H or maybe even a 2H, something that's a really light pencil so that I can just barely lightly draw in, sketch in an outline. The other thing is that I did a little bit more detail on the picture here so that you kind of get a sense of where the height of this curve is, but you don't have to do something that complicated. You really could just do a plain box that's a rectangle that would fit that object so that you get a sense of where that is in relationship to the pie plate, to the apple, etc. The next thing I'm going to do then is use citing, and I've got links to these other videos that explain more detail about how to do citing. And what I'm going to do are measure things on the photo. So you could measure the height of the pear and then compare it to the height of the picture on the photo. You want to create a relationship between those sizes on the photograph or on the objects itself. Here I'm showing you guys a photograph of a still life, but this would be if you were working from a still life in person as well. So once I create a relationship between those two objects, I can then correct my proportions using citing on the page. So I could do something like take a measurement of the height of the pear and say, no, I think it needs to be a little bit taller, or it needs to be a little bit shorter in relationship to how I drew the picture. So using citing to correct my portions is the next step. The next thing I'm going to do is actually switch from, and you can kind of see this here, I'm going to switch from the really boxed in style to then doing something that's a little bit more related to the objects at hand. So I would actually draw on the curves, but I'm not going to draw in any kind of detail. You can see I don't have the scalloped edge along the edge of the plate or much detail on the picture, but I've just gotten sort of the outline a little bit more solidified. And as I do that, the next step again would be checking the proportion. So things like how many of the cube would fit into the height of the pear. I would measure that on the photograph first, and then I would measure it on my drawing to see if it's the same relationship in sizes or if something needs to be adjusted. Okay, then the next step, and this is really the lightness that I draw with. You can see the difference. This is really dark for the camera. This is how I would normally draw so that I can make changes along the way. The next step, once you've checked all the proportions, is to draw in the small details. You don't want to do those details before you've checked the proportions, because you don't want to do those details before you've checked the proportions, because otherwise you're going to be drawing in and laboring over that that detail for a length of time. And if you find out that it's the wrong size, or it's it's too tall, it's not tall enough, it's too wide, it's not wide enough, or it's in the wrong place in relationship to the other things in the composition, you'll find that you have wasted all of this time. So for example, with my students who are doing the still life drawing in person as a part of their interview process to get into this school, they have 45 minutes, and if they've budgeted all of their time doing these fine detail things like this scalloped edge or this scalloped edge, they're going to find that they've wasted their time on the detail when suddenly they realize the picture is too big or it doesn't fit in relationship to the pie plate. So you want to do all of that measuring and basic layout stuff first, and then work on your detail. And then the last step is going to be drawing in a little bit of the shading and the shadows. So I'm going to do a little bit of that for you guys here now. I usually will go for drawing in the darks first and planning in a little bit of the cast shadows. And if you have 45 minutes, you're probably not going to fully render this entire scene or shade it in. Rendering is just a fancy word for shading it in. Okay, so you can see one of the things that I did was I started with the darks. I kind of kept them consistently on the same side. I made sure I put in cast shadows. I also kind of ranked the darknesses, so you can see that the cube in the front here is a little bit lighter than the plate stand in the back. And if it gets a little bit too dark, you can always use your gummy eraser and lighten that up, so that way it looks like it's in front. And then I didn't worry too much about shading it in perfectly. I wanted it to have a sketchy look, so I wasn't shy about using cross hatching or hatching so that I can get kind of that sketched in line. So hopefully that gives you guys a sense of how to do a still life from start to finish, where you're blocking things in, adjusting the proportion, and then checking the proportion as you then draw in more detail in the outline. And then the last round is sort of putting in all of the detail and the shading at the very end once you're sure that those proportions are correct. So hopefully you guys will be prepared if you have an interview like some of my students do, where they have to draw in front of other people. Let me know if you have any questions down below.